I was watching a live broadcast of a town hall meeting in South Jeolla recently, and it started out like any other dry administrative session. Local officials hunched over microphones, debating city mergers, industrial growth.
The usual stuff.
Exactly. And Governor Kim Hee-soo was at the podium, and he looked genuinely distressed as he was talking about this population cliff. He pointed out that his province alone, his province accounts for 20% of the regions in South Korea that are right now facing total extinction.
20%, just in his area.
And he asked the room, if there are no people, what's the point of saving the industry? And, up until that point, the atmosphere was pretty somber. Everyone got it. Everyone understood the gravity of living in a country with the lowest birth rate in the world, a place where experts predict the population could literally have in just 60 years.
A demographic death spiral.
But then Kim took a breath and he offered what he called a special measure. And this caused the entire room, and the live stream audience too, to just freeze. Yeah. He didn't suggest tax incentives or better childcare. No. Instead, he proposed the importation of young women from Sri Lanka and Vietnam, specifically virgins, to be married off to bachelors in these dying rural villages. The shift in the room was palpable. You could feel it through the screen. Wonju's mayor looked visibly stunned, and he immediately interjected, arguing that marriage and imports were entirely the wrong solutions. So one moment they're discussing the survival of their communities, and the next, a high-ranking official is talking about human beings as if they were bulk commodities, like things meant to patch a hole in a demographic spreadsheet.
It wasn't just a simple gaffe.
No, it wasn't just a lapse in gender sensitivity. It felt like a moment of pure, unfiltered desperation. And it makes you wonder, right? How dire has the situation actually become when the proposed solution for a vanishing nation is to treat people like a shipment of raw materials?
It stops you in your tracks, doesn't it?
Completely.
You hear those specific words, import and virgins, spoken into a microphone in a modern administrative hall in 2026. And your brain just does a double take.
Right. You have to rewind.
You check the date, you check the translation. It feels like we've stumbled into a dystopian novel, or maybe one of those colony management simulation games, not a serious policy debate in a G20 nation.
It felt like the mask of bureaucracy just slipped clean off. Usually politicians are, masters of euphemism. They talk about multicultural synergy or demographic countermeasures.
Global family integration, all that jargon.
All very polished, very safe language. But Governor Kim just bypassed all the PR filters. He didn't use the language of sociology. He used the language of logistics. He was talking about supply chain management, but the stock, in this case, happened to be women.
And, that lack of a filter is precisely why we have to dissect this moment. It is so easy to just get angry at the misogyny of the language, and we absolutely should be critical of that. But if we stop at the outrage, if we just, cancel the guy and move on, we miss the massive, terrifying context that pushed him to say it. Why? You have to look at the statistic he led with. He didn't start with the virgin comment out of nowhere. He started by holding up a map of his own province, South Jeolla, and saying that it holds 20% of the regions in South Korea facing extinction.
Extinction. That's a word that gets thrown around a lot in, say, climate science, but hearing it applied to cities and counties is, well, it's chilling. It's not a metaphor here, is it?
No, it is a statistical reality. Yeah. We aren't talking about a recession where people have less money. We aren't talking about a slump.
This is more final.
We are talking about communities where the maternity wards have closed because there are literally no babies being born, where elementary schools are being converted into nursing homes, or in some cases, just abandoned entirely, where the average age is climbing so high that, actuarially speaking, in 30 years, the town simply ceases to exist as a functioning human settlement. Governor Kim is looking at that abyss. He sees holes opening up in his territory.
So that context explains the desperation.
It explains the desperation. It doesn't excuse the dehumanization. In fact, it makes it scarier. But it explains why a modern official might revert to such a raw, commodified view of human life. He is in complete panic mode.
And the room knew it. The reaction of the Gwangju mayor, Kang Ki-jung, was fascinating to watch. He didn't just sit there and squirm. He jumped right in.
Right. And Mayor Kang, he stepped in to represent let's say, the modern ethical standard. Foreigners, marriage, and income are not the solutions to industrial problems. He was trying to pull the car back onto the road.
He was trying to recenter the conversation on economics.
His argument was that you need to fix the economy and the industry first. Build the nest and the birds will come. But Governor Kim's rebuttal was the haunting part. If there are no people, what's the point of saving the industry?
And that's the deadlock.
It's the ultimate chicken and egg problem that has paralyzed South Korean policy for decades. You can't have an economy without people, but people won't stay without an economy.
That's what struck me as so dangerous about this whole exchange. This wasn't a private gaffe. It wasn't a hot mic moment. This was a public proposal during a discussion about merging 9 cities and counties. This was high-level policy strategy.
He was on the official record.
And the fact that importing virgins was the special measure on the table tells me this isn't an isolated thought inside one man's head. It feels like the tip of a very large, very dark iceberg.
This incident, it tears the veil off a massive, decades-long system. We have to act like historians for a moment here. This didn't start with Governor Kim in 2026. This is the result of a machine, a marriage migration machine that has been running in the background of South Korean society since the 1990s.
So today we're going to be analyzing the ethical and human rights controversies surrounding South Korea's historical reliance on this state-sponsored international marriage migration, specifically comparing the treatment and integration challenges faced by Vietnamese and Filipino brides versus the official's recent import proposal.
To really understand how we got to a point where a governor is proposing the import of women, we have to look at what academics and sociologists call the marriage migration regime.
We usually use that for military juntas or, I don't know, strict diets. It implies a high level of control.
It's used deliberately. When we think of marriage, especially in the West or in modern media, we think of romance, serendipity, 2 people meeting in a coffee shop, locking eyes across the room.
The Hollywood version.
Right. But when you look at the scale of what is happening in South Korea, particularly with Vietnamese and other Southeast Asian women, it is not just a collection of individual love stories. It is a system. It is a regime involving 3 very distinct actors acting in a triangle.
Okay, let's break down the players in this regime. Who are we dealing with here?
First, you have the state, the government. They create the rules, the visa categories, and crucially, they create the vacuum by failing to fix the rural economy in the first place.
So they're both the cause of the problem and the regulator of the supposed solution.
Exactly. Second, you have the matchmakers, the brokers. They are the ones who interpret those rules for profit. They're the middlemen, the agents on the ground.
The ones making it all happen.
And third, you have the migrants, the women themselves, who have to navigate this incredibly complex maze for their own survival and very often the survival of their families back home.
It's a marketplace, a regulated and maybe not so regulated marketplace for human connection.
And to see how this marketplace evolved, we have to rewind the clock. Governor Kim mentioned Sri Lanka and Vietnam specifically, but it hasn't always been those countries. If we go back to the early 1990s, the rural bachelor problem was already a flashing red light on the dashboard.
This was when the urbanization boom was really stripping the countryside, right? The miracle on the Han River was in full swing.
Yes. The industrial miracle of South Korea was happening almost exclusively in the cities. Young people, and we will discuss why it was specifically young women later, were leaving the villages in droves for Seoul. This left a surplus of men in rural areas who were tied to the land.
Yeah.
Farmers, small business owners.
Men who couldn't just pack up and leave.
Correct. And initially, local governments didn't look to Southeast Asia. They looked much closer to home, in a sense. They looked to China, specifically the Joseon-joke.
The ethnic Koreans living in China.
Right. The logic was very blood-based and, frankly, nationalistic. The government thought, they share our DNA, they share our history, they speak a version of our language. It was seen almost as a kind of family reunion.
A way to solve the problem while also, in their view, strengthening the nation.
That was the idea.
So why did that stop? Why are we talking about Vietnam now instead of China?
Economics. It's almost always economics. As China's own economy just exploded in the late 90s and early 2000s, the incentive structure completely changed.
The opportunities at home got better.
Dramatically better. If you are a Korean Chinese woman living in a rapidly developing China, do you want to move to a remote South Korean farm to do hard agricultural labor and care for an elderly mother-in-law? The answer increasingly became no. The stream just dried up.
So the demand, the rural bachelors, was still there, but the supply from that particular source was cut off.
Correct. And this is where the regime pivots. The brokers who had built a business on this needed a new product. And this is, for me, one of the most crucial points of the whole story. You really cannot understand the current Korean demographic landscape without understanding what happened in Taiwan in 2004.
Taiwan, that seems totally unrelated. What does Taiwan have to do with South Korean farmers?
Everything. It's like a hydraulic system. If you squeeze one part of the balloon, the air has to go somewhere else. Up until 2004, Taiwan was actually the #1 destination for Vietnamese brides. It was a massive, well-established industry.
Bigger than Korea at the time.
Bigger. But the Taiwanese government started seeing horrific reports. Human trafficking, rampant abuse, women being sold essentially as indentured servants with no rights.
So they took action?
They slammed the brakes on, hard. They implemented incredibly strict interview processes for visas. They banned profit-oriented brokerage outright. They essentially killed the commercial market for foreign brides in Taiwan in an effort to protect human rights.
Okay, but the supply side, to use Governor Kim's gross terminology again, was still there. You still had brokers in Vietnam with networks of women who wanted to migrate for economic reasons.
So you had a massive infrastructure of recruiters and women in Vietnam looking for a destination to improve their economic standing for their families. Suddenly, the door to Taiwan is welded shut. So what does a business do when its primary market disappears overnight?
It finds a new market.
Almost overnight, the entire apparatus pivoted north to South Korea.
Wow, so South Korea basically inherited this entire industry by accident.
By accident and by, you could argue, negligence. South Korea didn't have those strict laws in place yet. So from 2004 to 2006, the numbers just exploded. It was a gold rush. And that brings us to the Grand Plan.
The Grand Plan, it sounds like a title from a heist movie, or maybe a Bond villain scheme. Just laughs. It was actually a government initiative launched in 2006. The central government finally woke up and realized, wait a minute, we have a multicultural society forming here, whether we planned for it or not. So they tried to create a framework for integration, for language support, for cultural centers.
They were trying to catch up to the reality on the ground.
Exactly. But while the government was making players and forming committees, the brokers were making money, hand over fist.
I want to drill down on these brokers, because reading the source material, it's visceral. This isn't like a modern dating app. It's industrial.
It is highly transactional. Let's just walk through the marriage tour package as it's described in the research. A Korean man, usually from a rural area, often older, pays a hefty fee to a broker.
Roughly.
It varies, but often tens of thousands of US dollars. This is a significant, life-altering investment for a farmer.
So for that money, what does he get?
He gets a package deal. Round-trip airfare to Vietnam, hotel accommodations, and then there are the group meetings. Group meetings. That sounds so corporate, so sterile.
It's a lineup. It's an audition. He flies in, sits in a room, and views a group of women who have been brought there by the broker. He picks one. Sometimes he picks 2 or 3 to interview briefly, usually through a translator because, of course, they don't speak the same language.
And once a selection is made, what happens?
They often have a wedding ceremony within days.
Days. So you can meet her on a Tuesday and be legally married to her by Friday.
Sometimes even faster. The package even includes gifts to the in-laws as part of the fee.
It feels like buying a car. You pay the sticker price, they throw in the floor mats as a gift, and you drive off the lot.
And that power dynamic, that transactional nature, is baked into the marriage forever. The man feels he has purchased a wife, and the brokers, they control all the information in the lead-up. They coach the women on how to act, what to say to pass the visa interview. They manage the relationship via translated messages while the paperwork is being processed. And ironically, as the Korean government tried to tighten the laws by requiring language tests for the women or income proof from the men, the process became too complicated for a regular person to navigate.
So the regulations actually backfired.
Yes. By making the paperwork harder, they made the brokers more necessary. The brokers became the indispensable gatekeepers. You couldn't just meet someone and bring them over easily anymore. You needed the specialist who knew how to work the system.
But we have to talk about the women in this, because Governor Kim called them virgins and implies they're just these passive goods to be imported, but the sources suggest something very, very different is going on from their perspective.
This is maybe the most important corrective to Governor Kim's worldview. These women are not passive cargo. They're active agents in their own story. They are smart, strategic decision makers. The research shows that many Vietnamese women enter these marriages driven by a powerful cultural force: Confucian filial piety.
Usually we associate that with staying home and caring for your parents directly.
In this modern globalized context, it means sacrificing your own immediate comfort to provide for your parents' well-being. They see migration to Korea as an economic strategy for their family. They know Korea is a wealthier country. They want to go there, work, and send remittances back to Vietnam to build a house for their parents or pay for a younger sibling's education.
So it's an act of profound family loyalty.
So when the governor talks about importing them, he's ignoring their agency entirely. He thinks he's getting a submissive, traditional rural housewife who will just sit there and be grateful. But he's actually getting a woman who has a very specific economic mission for her own family.
And that is a fundamental disconnect.
Exactly. And that disconnect is where the tragedy so often happens. The Korean husband thinks he paid for a wife who will serve his parents and work on his farm. The Vietnamese wife thinks she married a partner who will help her support her family back home.
And those two expectations are bound to crash.
When they crash, when the husband stops her from sending money home or treats her like a servant because he paid for her, the marriage can collapse into abuse and misery.
And the government has been funding this crash. That's the part that really surprised me. The International Marriage Support Ordinances.
4 years since roughly 2006, local governments, desperate, just like Governor Kim, have been legally using taxpayer money to pay the brokerage fees for rural bachelors.
And so my tax dollars, if I lived in one of these municipalities, would be going to a broker to fly a guy to Vietnam to pick a wife from a lineup.
Yes, for nearly 20 years, the state was directly subsidizing this very industry.
But that's changing now, right? I read about the National Human Rights Commission ruling on this.
That is a huge and very recent development. In April 2025, just a year before Governor Kim's outburst, the NHRCK celebrated the abolition of these ordinances in 25 local governments.
Why did they finally kill them? What was the official reasoning?
The language the commission used was blistering. They didn't mince words at all. They said these ordinances encouraged marriage trafficking, a very strong term.
That's legally loaded language.
They said it treated women as tools for childbirth and childcare and as unpaid agricultural labor. And they explicitly stated that this policy reduced migrant women to second-class citizens, whose only purpose was to fill the demographic gap left by domestic women fleeing the countryside.
Tools for childbirth. That connects right back to Governor Kim's mindset. He wasn't saying anything new. He was just saying it out loud after the official policy had finally turned against it. He was voicing the logic that had been operating for 2 decades.
He is a relic of a system that is being dismantled on human rights grounds. But he's clinging to it because, from his panicked perspective, he has no other tools left in the toolbox. The marriage migration regime was a band-aid on a much, much deeper wound. The total collapse of rural society. And that brings us to the structural trap.
And that means investigating how the extreme centralization of South Korea's political and economic power in the Seoul metropolitan area exacerbates this rural demographic collapse, forcing local officials into these desperate, ethically questionable policy suggestions that really just reflect a failure of national bureaucratic efficiency.
Right.
We keep saying rural collapse, but I really want to visualize what that means. Why is the countryside emptying out? Why is Seoul the only game in town?
It's what people call the Seoul Republic. That's the term non-metropolitan dwellers use. And the data backs them up completely. If you look at the historical data from the World Bank, this isn't a new problem. This has been a runaway train since the 1980s.
Okay, so give me some numbers. How bad is the concentration?
Even back in 1980, Seoul, a city that occupies only 0.63% of the country's land, held 22.3% of the total population.
Almost a quarter of the country on less than 1% of the land.
But the population density is just the start. Look at the concentration of power. In the 80s, Seoul held 46.6% of all finance jobs, 81% of managerial jobs, 66% of all college students in the entire country.
81% of managerial jobs. That's staggering. So basically, if you wanted to be a boss of anything, you had to be in Seoul. There was no other option.
Correct. And if you wanted to go to a good university, Seoul. If you wanted a loan for your business, Seoul. It created a kind of gravity well, a black hole that sucked all the talent, capital, and ambition out of the rest of the peninsula. The Seoul Republic isn't just a catchy nickname. It describes a city-state that has dominated the nation.
But surely the government saw this coming. I mean, if you have all your eggs in one basket, that tiny 0.63% of your land, that's a huge security risk, an economic risk. It's a risk on every level.
Oh, they knew. That's the real tragedy of it all. They knew, and they tried to stop it. The sources detailed decades of relocation policies. They tried to force factories to move out of the capital. They issued relocation orders. They even had a secret plan in the late 70s to build an entirely new capital city just to decentralize power.
A secret capital city? You mean like a hidden base? Yeah.
Under the Park Chung-hee administration, they realized Seoul was not only too crowded, but also dangerously vulnerable to North Korean artillery. It's very close to the border. So they actually drew up what were called paper plans to build an entirely new administrative capital down south.
So a Brasilia or a Canberra for Korea.
Exactly. They did the background studies. They chose candidate locations. It was going to be the new heart of the nation, safe and modern.
Then why are we still talking about Seoul being the center of everything?
Politics and money, as always. President Park was assassinated in 1979. And the political will, the momentum for such a massive project, died with him. It was deemed too expensive and too politically risky by his successors, so it remained a ghost city on paper. Instead, they fell back on trying to force the private sector to move.
Like factory, you have to move to the coast.
Yes. They designated new industrial cities like Banwol and tried to force factories to move there. But this is where we run into a crucial academic concept that explains why it all failed. Agglomeration economies.
Okay, agglomeration economies. It sounds like something from a dusty old textbook, but it seems really important here.
It's probably the most important concept in urban economics. Think of it like a gravity well or maybe a sticky web. Imagine you are a fashion designer in Seoul. You need fabric suppliers. You need button manufacturers. You need dye specialists. You need a bank that understands the seasonality of fashion. You need a shipping company that handles delicate garments. And crucially, you need to have lunch with other designers to know what the trend is for next season.
And all of those people, all those services are located within a few square miles in Seoul.
Exactly. The whole ecosystem is there. Now, if the government forces you to move your factory 200 miles away to a rice paddy in South Jeolla, you lose that entire network. You are now an island. You might pay less for rent, sure, but your transaction costs, the cost of doing business, of getting information, of shipping, they skyrocket. You're out of the loop.
So business owners just did the math, and the math said stay put.
And the math said stay in Seoul. It was a clear calculation. The sources show 50% of firms in one survey explicitly cited financial problems or market access as the reason they refused to move. They would rather pay the government fines for non-compliance than commit commercial suicide by leaving the cluster.
Or they pulled the headquarters trick. That was a detail I loved in the research. It was so clever.
The headquarters trick.
Yeah.
Yes, this was their big loophole. The government would say, move your factory, and the company would say, okay, sure. They would move the dirty, loud factory floor with the assembly line jobs to the province to satisfy the order.
They checked the box.
Right. But they would keep the HQ, the strategy team, the R&D, the marketing department, and all the money in a shiny building in Seoul.
So the rural areas got the pollution and the minimum wage jobs, and Seoul kept all the wealth and the high-paying brain jobs.
Which brings us right back to the demographic. If the high-paying jobs, the universities, the culture, the power are all in Seoul, why would any ambitious young person stay in South Jeolla?
It wouldn't, and they don't, and that's the spiral.
This is what creates the population cliff that so terrified Governor Kim. It's a vicious, self-reinforcing cycle. Young people leave for opportunities, the local tax base collapses, the local government can't afford to build nice parks or modern hospitals, so more people leave.
And it's specifically young women who leave first and in greater numbers.
Crucial. Rural areas are often more socially conservative, more patriarchal. If you are a young, ambitious woman, Seoul offers not just a better job, but also anonymity and social freedom. So you leave. And this leaves the rural villages full of aging parents and the rural bachelors.
The men who stayed behind to inherit the family farm or business.
Right. And now these men are unmarriageable in the local market because there are simply no women their age left. And the local government is broke, so they can't attract people back with high-tech jobs or fancy new infrastructure.
So when you have no money, no infrastructure, and no young women,
you try to buy them. That is the brutal, desperate logic that Governor Kim arrived at. When you can't build a Silicon Valley in South Jeolla, the only resource you can try to acquire quickly is humans. Hence, the import proposal. It is a symptom of a total 50-year administrative failure to balance the nation's growth. He is trying to patch a huge structural wound with a human rights violation.
It's just incredible how all of this is connected. The import comment isn't just a moment of sexism. It's a direct result of economic geography. It's the ghost of the secret capital plan. But there's another layer here. We've talked about jobs and money, but the sources suggest there's an even bigger driver of this exodus, something that scares Korean parents even more than unemployment for their kids.
The education trap.
We need to do a comparative analysis of how deeply entrenched Confucian social structures and this intense educational competition in South Korea and Japan contribute to the world's lowest fertility rates, and look at whether government incentives or cultural shifts are more effective in reversing the demographic decline.
This is central to the whole problem. The World Bank survey asked those employees the question directly: why won't you move out of Seoul? I, like you, assumed salary would be number one.
I would have guessed salary too, or maybe, nightlife or culture.
Number one was housing, which is very expensive in Seoul at 29%. But number two, right on its heels at 27.3%, was children's education.
Not their own career, their children's future.
Yes. The hagwons, the cram schools,
No.
the tutors.
It's the famous educational arms race.
In South Korea, getting your child into a top university, specifically one of the SKY universities, which are Seoul National, Korea, and Yonsei, is seen by many as the only path to a secure, successful future. And the entire infrastructure for that, the best tutors, the most famous academies, the competitive peer groups, it is all hyper-concentrated in a few districts in Seoul.
So if you move your family to a rural province, many parents feel like they are actively sabotaging their child's future before it even begins.
Exactly. It's seen as a kind of parental malpractice. And this leads to that absolutely heartbreaking phenomenon mentioned in the notes: the two households family structure.
This part was tragic to read about. Even when the government forced high-ranking employees, say a factory manager, to move to a provincial industrial site, the employees wouldn't take their families with them.
Oh. The father would move down to the province, live alone in a small lodging or a company dormitory during the week, and send his salary back to his wife and kids, who remained in Seoul.
Just so the kids could stay in the Seoul school district and go to the right hagwon?
Yes. Entire families voluntarily separating themselves for years on end to survive the education system. They become goose fathers, migrating to support the family, but living in profound isolation.
So let's connect this back to Governor Kim's proposal. He wants to bring Vietnamese women into these rural areas to start new families, but what happens when those women have children?
They face the exact same impossible problem. And this is where the cultural deadlock hits with the force of a freight train.
Explain that deadlock for us.
Yeah.
What are the two opposing forces?
On one side, you have the rural Korean husband. He is often influenced by more traditional Confucian values. He wants a wife not just for companionship, but to fulfill a role, caring for his aging parents, bearing a son to carry on the family name. He needs her labor on the farm. He needs her to assimilate and be local.
But the Vietnamese wife, we have to remember, she's an active agent with her own motivations.
Yeah. She is smart. She is ambitious for her own family. She quickly learns about the Korean educational standard. She sees the society around her. She realizes that if her child grows up in this dying village with a failing school and no cram schools, that child will be left behind permanently. She doesn't want her child to be a second-class citizen.
So she wants to move to the city, too, for her kid.
Precisely. The education trap doesn't care about your nationality. It pressures everyone equally. The very same structural force that emptied the countryside of Korean women in the first place is going to impact these new mixed nationality families in the exact same way. You can't just import a wife and expect her to be immune to the fundamental pressures of Korean society. She will want to move to Seoul for her kid, just like the Korean women did before her.
So the solution fails even if it works initially. You get the bride, you have the kid, and then the family unit feels the same pressure to leave the rural area anyway. It's a leaky bucket.
It's a completely leaky bucket.
Yeah.
And the government's attempts to patch this with cash are, well, frankly, they are negligible. It's almost insulting.
The news source mentioned this thing called rural basic income.
Right. They're offering vouchers worth about 150,000 won a month. That's roughly $100 US.
$100 a month? That's a nice dinner for two. That's not a reason to move your entire life to a dying village.
It doesn't even cover a fraction of a single hagwon fee for one subject. It doesn't compensate for the lack of a major hospital nearby when your parent gets sick. It doesn't compensate for the cultural isolation. It's a token gesture. It's trying to put a small Band-Aid on a massive gunshot wound.
You know, we started this whole deep dive by being shocked at Governor Kim's import comment. And don't get me wrong, I'm still shocked. The language is gross. But the more we talk, the more I realize that his underlying premise was actually rational.
Rational in a cold, horrifying, and dehumanizing way, yes.
He said, what's the point of saving the industry if there were no people? When you cut through all the noise, that's the most rational thing anyone said in that room.
It is the fundamental truth they are all grappling with. South Korea built an incredible industrial machine. It concentrated everything in Seoul to maximize efficiency. It built a world-class education system to create a hyper-skilled workforce. But in doing so, it created an environment where human reproduction, the creation of families, the raising of children became inefficient, astronomically expensive, and geographically impossible for half the country.
The machine worked so well it ground up the human operators.
The infrastructure exists. The roads, the factories, the power grid are all there. But the social structure required to support human life has been completely hollowed out by this relentless soul or nothing competition. Governor Kim is standing in the wreckage of that success, trying to restock the human inventory.
So we've really gone on a journey today. We started with a shocking headline about importing virgins, and we've ended up uncovering a 50-year history of failed urban planning. We've looked at the predatory marriage brokers, the brave but conflicted women navigating this regime, and the parents living in separate cities just to keep their kid in a good math class.
And we can see now that these aren't separate stories at all. They're all one story. The import proposal is hideous, but it is the desperate scream of a dying region. The official treated women like raw materials because, in the cold calculation of the state for the last 50 years, population has simply become another dwindling industrial input, like running out of coal or steel.
We talk about saving the nation or saving the economy, but if the solutions involve stripping away humanity, if the solution is state-sponsored marriage trafficking or forcing families to live apart for education or treating women as childbirth tools, then what exactly are we saving?
That's the chilling question at the heart of it all. If a nation is just an economy seeking labor units, is it really a society anymore? Or is it just a business that's run in a staff?